All right. I think we're ready to get started today. Thanks everyone for joining us. For those of you who are new to Bellwether, we are a national nonprofit that works with a range of organizations, school districts, state education departments, charter networks, policy advocates, nonprofits, and more to help them solve problems and create better educational experiences for young people. We also publish reports and resources and host conversations like this one on some of the most pressing questions facing the sector today. This LinkedIn Live is sponsored by Curriculum Associates. Curriculum Associates is dedicated to making K-12 education classrooms better for 17 million students and 1 million educators by uniting meaningful data insights with high-quality instruction. They partner with educators to develop a connected portfolio of iReady solutions spanning adaptive assessment, personalized instruction, and core curriculum in ELA and math. Curriculum Associates measures success by the impact it makes on student outcomes and is honored to support the extraordinary work of educators to help every student thrive. While our sponsors make events like this possible, they have no editorial control over the content, and so the views you will hear today are those of the panelists alone. A few housekeeping items before we jump in. Feel free to ask any questions using the question box. We'll leave time to answer as many of those at the end as we can. If you need to leave early or just want to watch any of the part of the conversation back again, we are recording this conversation. We'll be sharing the video once it is complete with all registrants. And then finally, we host lots of conversations in a variety of issues. So if you want to get notified about future events, be sure to sign up for our email list, and we'll drop that link into the to the sign up form in the chat in just a moment. All right. So with that, I'm excited about the lineup of panelists we have with us to discuss how education savings accounts can work best for families. I'm joined today by three friends of mine. I'm excited to have their insights and expertise coming from a variety of perspectives on ESAs and sitting sort of in different seats and what it takes to take ESAs from policy to practice and to ensure that they work to support families and their students. First is Liz Cohen. She's the Vice President of Policy at 50CAN, an education advocacy organization. She previously worked at Future Ed at Georgetown, where she authored Early Returns, First Results from the New Wave of Public Funding of Private Schooling, which is a huge resource to me and many others in the sector on sort of the first findings on ESA policies. Justin Dent is the founder and executive director of Outschool.org, an organization dedicated to supporting families so that ESA funds turn into real opportunities. Alongside our friends at Reschool Colorado, Outschool published two briefs recently. One is Putting Families in the Driver's Seat, and the other is The Transformative Power of Microgrant Programs. And then finally is Jackie Guglielmo. She's the Vice President of Services at ACE Scholarships, which is a scholarship granting organization that helps families access educational opportunities for their children. Prior to joining ACE, Jackie was the Executive Director of Indiana's ESA program within the Office of the State Treasurer. Thank you all so much for joining us and for engaging in this conversation. I'm eager to dig in and want to start with just some table setting. Many folks who are watching this, and certainly all of our panelists know, the country has been through a wave of state policy making, seeing existing ESA programs expand and seeing new ESA programs launch. Now we also have a federal tax credit scholarship program included in the One Big Beautiful Act that will look differently depending on how the regulations around that are written by the Treasury Department, but could function similarly to an ESA. And so there is a moment to engage in a conversation about what it takes to have an ESA operationalize effectively, even after it's passed. So what happens after the policy-making process? With that, and starting with you, Liz, you've analyzed and written about ESA policies a lot. Could you start by just providing a description for our audience of what an ESA is and how it's different from a school voucher policy? And then also would love your thoughts on, sort of based on the research you have done, where you see challenges in policy design that affect implementation.
So just a few small questions to start.
Yeah.
So this ESA voucher thing, some people think this is like, it's just definitional, but I really am glad we started with this because I actually think it's incredibly foundational to what's different about what's happening now in school choice than previous iterations. So a voucher, which is our historical instrument for paying for, well, school in this case, right, is like a coupon. It's like, you have something that you can give to someone else, and then someone else is sending the money. It means that parents could say, we want the money to go to this school. It has to always be sent to a school. It is for tuition at a school. And then the, whichever government agency is in charge sends the money directly to the school at the parent's direction. The parent is directing the money, but the parent does not have full control of the money. They can just point in the direction they want the money to go. An education savings account is a different thing altogether, much like a lot of folks might have a flexible spending account for healthcare, things like that. It's actual money that you can control the expenditure of through some kind of wallet system. Now, states, of course, put very important guardrails on what that money can be spent on, but it gives the parent much more control and allows, therefore, for a lot of additional flexibility in what you could use that money for. So historically, vouchers, you can't use vouchers, for instance, to support homeschooling families, because those homeschooling families, by definition, are not paying tuition to a school. And so it really opens the door to think completely differently. As my boss, Gerald Bradford, likes to say, this is really a revolution in school finance. Even more than it is a revolution in school choice. So that's like the really big difference. And so when you start thinking about policy design, so one of the big differences is that we can now say who should be able to take advantage of these ESAs. And so policy design choices include things like, do you have to be enrolled in a school or not? Can it be used for costs that are not only tuition? And we see that in quite a few states that are allowing homeschool families to participate in ESAs. We also see big policy designs choices around sort of income level of eligibility. A big sort of sea change in this movement in the last 5 years has been the move towards a universal school choice. So the history of private school vouchers, when they used to be only vouchers, was that it was really for very low income families in sort of failing school environments. And now this is really philosophically a totally different situation, because many states allow families at any income level or at many income levels to participate and then sort of direct these funds in a variety of ways. It also means even in a state like Iowa requires you to first use the money on tuition, but if there's money left over, which there isn't often, but theoretically if there was, you could then say, I want to use the remaining money on after school tutoring or other, some additional class that my child wants to take. So it does allow for more flexibility. And what we're really seeing is that demand for that flexibility from families, especially coming out of the pandemic. There's just so many more options out there for how your child can be educated. And so the flexibility of these vehicles allows for policy design that can set out guardrails and expectations, but really take advantage of this surge in demand for what education can look like.
Thank you for that. And for the ESA 101 and then the 201 all within just a few minutes. Let's dig in and hear a little bit from Jackie. You at ACE Scholarships, and as well as leading the implementation of Indiana's ESA policy, you have, I think, a really on the ground perspective of what it takes to go from policy design to implement to an operational ESA program. What would you sort of add to the implementation challenges that Liz described?
Yeah, would absolutely echo what Liz said, and then add probably 3 suggestions. I'm sure I could add many, many more, but specifically around spend, 3, I think, components stand out in my mind. One is removing barriers and complexities for families to be able to spend the money. We're unfortunately trying to solve a problem for the fraction of a percent, right? But because the articles that we're seeing are about misuse of funds, when misuse of funds in these programs is actually a fraction fraction of a percent. However, we are creating and over-regulating, and that's, as I'm sure Justin will mention, this is leading families to leave money on the table. And so it's really creating a barrier for families to reach their full potential using these accounts. The second would be clarifying and avoiding very vague terms in policy when it comes to the allowable expenses in the law. So, I was an educator for many years. I was a board certified behavior analyst working with students with disabilities. And the term educational supplement means everything and nothing to me, right? So an important thing to note here, Julie, is that when these programs, when these laws are passed and these programs are ready for implementation, the actual program manager, which is either a member of a state agency, like an executive director at the treasurer's office, or a third party scholarship granting organization, right? They are tasked now with filling in the blanks of those definitions. They are making very big, very complicated, very difficult decisions about what that terminology means. And so creating, policy that really defines those terms or avoids using them altogether, I think would allow families to really maximize use of the funds. And then the third piece I would comment on when it comes to policy is allowing for rollover of the funds. Studying human behavior, I think a lot about what those policies actually result in, and how if the families are feeling like it's a use it or lose it system, we see a lot of different behavioral patterns when it comes to spending, as opposed to policies that allow families to roll over remaining funds into the following years, which leads to more fiscal responsibility and frugal spending, and really thinking about the future of that child's account, either saving for high school expenses or utilizing some for upfront cost and offsetting costs of other things later. So those are policy components I think would really contribute positively to ESAs.
And now to you, Justin, especially based on your work helping families access ESAs, what would you add to some of the implementation challenges of operationalizing these programs?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. I think it's interesting. So these policies are, as much as they're creating revolutions in school finance, right, they are creating education marketplaces where there weren't necessarily ones before, right? And they're making those marketplaces accessible to a lot more families than ever really had the ability to go out into the universe of tutors, therapists, curriculum, and providers that existed previously. And so, what is happening kind of when we take the legislation and then go into the rules making process is we are defining the parameters which will define what supply and what vendors are ultimately able to come in and what families are able to access. And that is, I think, a key point that is not often really realized until later down the road, when we start to see that the supply is not always there to meet the demand of families or to really help families kind of fulfill the most permissive, most free version of what some of the legislative intent might have been behind these policies. And so then there's work that needs to be done in order to either change or remedy policy to make it more accommodating for certain types of supply, or there has to be very active work done to then get the right supply on the marketplace to both attract, keep, and satisfy families who are in the program. I think one of the interesting use cases that really speaks to what Liz was talking about in the way of this is not a voucher is that in a lot of states, families are able to use their funds to fund transportation, right? Which is a really critical role or really critical item in terms of facilitating a more permissive education that a traditional voucher would never touch. But when you think about what does it actually take for a low-income family to make use of and take advantage of a more permissive unbundled education, ding, 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 transportation is a huge one, right? Because how am I going to shuttle my kid back and forth, particularly if I'm not in a major urban area, to these different resources that I now have access to? And then the question becomes, are there enough transportation providers on the platform to then meet the demand that families have for services like that? And was there enough attention and consideration given to that in the policy? And so I think everything that, that Jackie and Liz said is absolutely true. And so, but I think the one thing that I would add is, I think as we're thinking about these policies and as we're thinking about turning them into implementation, what is the supply that this is going to attract, cultivate, and how does that then relate to the demand that families have? because I think one of the other major challenges that families often have, particularly when a policy is much more focused on perhaps private school tuition than it is homeschool or more a broader degree of allowable expenses, is if I don't get into my first choice school, what's next? And I think we've seen reports come out of Florida and other states that will often show that folks do not persist through the program if they do not get into their first choice, or if the supply is not sufficient in the way of kind of private schools in order for them to then make a choice, because it's a lot of work to find that first choice. It's even more work to come up with a second, third, fourth option, which is going to happen if private schools don't have unlimited demand. And so really thinking through then, what are the infrastructure to support families when first choices are not available, I think is another really important part of that supply consideration.
Yeah, can I jump in? I just realized one, I think, important context for folks listening is the scale of like where we are now. So I thought I might just throw out a couple numbers to help context set. So we think there's something like 1.3 million kids across the US, roughly, using some kind of ESA this year. In the work I had done at Georgetown, we had originally looked at 8 states that had universal eligibility programs. In the 23-24 school year, there were about 580,000 kids participating. The last year, the 1 year later, there were over 800,000. So we haven't seen, it's important to say, we haven't seen the ceiling on demand. Although I will say, I think there is a ceiling. We just don't quite know what it is yet. There will be some kind of equilibrium reached. It's also important to note that if you look at Florida private schools right now, if you look at the number of families who are actually fully self-pay for private schools in Florida, that number is now almost zero. Almost every family in Florida, because there is no income limits to eligibility, are now using this. And so the other piece around policy design that I think is really important, even before you get to implementation, right, is that it's an opportunity for states to say, what is the purpose of publicly funded education? And what is it that we're actually trying to fund? What do we want all kids to grow up knowing, learning, having? And then how do we design a policy that gets us to that goal? And that is very different than how we often think about education, which often pits traditional public education against private education. And I want to say that I think that policy design is also taking a moment to talk about the big picture. What are we actually trying to do here?
That's great.
On that too, if you don't mind, Julie, because it leads my mind immediately to the big whole accountability discussion, which has become sort of a contentious word in a lot of these conversations. But I think Liz and Justin have touched on a really important factor, right? One is combined, right? One is supply, and the other is really allowing families to select using these funds where they want to go and how they want to educate around sort of a framework of what we're hoping for children and students to take away into their post-secondary pathway. And parents are really unable to do that if they're pigeonholed into a certain type of school or certain type of education, or if there's huge barriers to entry into the market for those suppliers, whether that's micro schools or different newer types of private schools. And that can really, really be limiting to not only families, but the movement in general. And so I think as we think of policy going forward and a kind of policy that supports education savings accounts, we need to think about allowing for more suppliers to come into this industry and allowing families full flexibility in where they want to educate, because it's not really for us to determine what that accountability really looks like. It's for the families to be able to select if that educational setting is meeting that child's needs, and if not, they will leave.
Yeah, Julie, if you don't mind, I'll jump in.
Please.
I think it's, so yes, there's the policy, there's the legislation that governs kind of the ESA, and then there are the rules that help to kind of create a more specific container for it. But those aren't the only policies at play, right? Because I think across the country, you're seeing even more public schools and charter schools want to come online in ESA states and offer AP French and offer discrete offerings, right? And that's a whole nother set of policies that states then have to look at in order, okay, then what are the inter-district transfer policies that I need? Or what are the policies on my local level that will allow me to, or at my state level, to then come online as part of this ESA, so that I'm actually able to create a more differentiated offering and able to still support, public schools can still support the community in that sense, even if they're not enrolled in the full day. And I don't think that level of policy has really caught up to the opportunity that exists. And I think there's like oh, wait, this doesn't have to be antithetical to public school, right? That public school can actually integrate into these marketplaces, but there has to be a policy consideration and discussion and action in order to make that both like accessible and allowable for the schools themselves.
Yeah, a great example of that is in Utah. So if you go on the education marketplace for Utah Fits All, there's like 10 school districts that are listed inside the education marketplace. I talked to a handful of them last year. They're mostly serving pretty small numbers, but they're able to offer things like one district has a few kids who are enrolled in a half-day Spanish immersion program, so they come for the Spanish half of the day, and they're paying for that out of the Utah Fits All scholarship. There's a high school where kids are doing theater, so they're taking a theater class, and then they're able to participate in the after-school theater program. I think Utah, because Utah in particular has a long, rich history with homeschool, they were a little bit more perhaps just accepting of the idea of this flexibility. But to Justin's point about policy, the question is, how do you take in funds? That's not something school districts are normally able to do. And they were it's funny, they were already using a system to reimburse teachers for things, and they realized pretty easily without a lot of big policy hurdles that they could just flip that system to take money in from families. So, it's far from perfect and it's very small, but this is the kind of innovation around implementation that I actually think is really exciting for how we can build a system that works better for everybody.
Liz, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it was when we implemented Utah, while there were public schools that were excited to get on board and willing to get on board, and you hit the nail on the head with the just kind of rich history of homeschooling and this hybrid approach to education, a piece that the public schools were missing is the understanding of how they could quantify their classes and unbundle those services to actually charge ESA students in a different way that they were charging homeschooling. So without getting into the kind of the weeds there, it's so important. Our executive director was extremely experienced with charter schools and public schools and private schools. So he understood the funding, and he lived in Utah, right? So he understood the funding mechanism, and he was able to go and present sort of a cost structure sample that was incredibly helpful to the public schools that wanted to come on board, but were confused about how to charge, because that was something that was outside of what they had typically done. So having that support, having that community, engagement was critical to the onboarding of the schools that we were able to pull into the platform.
Mm-hmm. I think we've already touched on this theme so much, but I want to spend a little bit more here. So we've got on one end, there are these tensions within ESA programs. On the one hand, there's a lot of attention being paid to how the dollars are being spent and making sure that they are being used according to their intended purpose. And we've seen some anecdotal accounts of questions of whether a trampoline or a chicken coop is like an appropriate expenditure of an ESA fund. And that is really sort of putting pressure on the public officials and those who are supporting implementation to be very careful about how they interpret statute, about what is allowable, and sort of making sure that families are spending the dollars in ways that can't be, or at least likely to be, sort of questioned publicly or politically, etc. On the other hand, we have families coming from lots of different backgrounds, some homeschool who are very used to sort of unbundling education, all the way to sort of traditionally families who have been in the public school system and aren't used to that, and families from lots of different income levels, trying to navigate a marketplace with these constraints on top of that marketplace. And so would love to think just a little bit and hear from each of you a little bit about what is the tension as you see it in your seats between the need to sort of oversee the use of funds according to the uses outlined in statute, knowing that those are public dollars and taxpayer dollars, with trying to enable families to be able to find the options or option that best suits their children's needs and have as much flexibility as possible in doing so. How does that play out? And then would love to hear specifically, how does that play out for different families who are either used to or not used to having that kind of flexibility? Jackie, maybe I'll start with you, since you've been implementing this both as an SGO and then previously at Indiana. Tell us about what the process entails of taking a statute and translating it into the eligible use of funds.
Sure. Yeah, I have a teeny bit of experience trying to define what that looks like for all sorts of families. And so my experience is incredibly unique. Not only implementing two programs, one from a state agency and one from a nonprofit, but the two programs are incomparable, right? So when Indiana launched, it looked very, very different than the first day of the Utah program, right? Different in scale, different in scope, different in student eligibility, different in volume of transactions and type of transactions. So when you're looking at the policy, and again, can't emphasize enough, the program manager now has this list of 14 different categories of eligible expenses and is tasked with defining what are the items, what are the actual activities that fall into all of these definitions. And you can never anticipate everything that a family is going to purchase, that they're going to make the justification that it fits in that category. And so I would say first and foremost, unless you've done it, right? Unless you've made the sausage, it's really, really hard to judge what that process looks like, because you could think that you've planned and prepared, and you haven't, you never will enough. So lawmakers, communities, families need to have understanding, have to have grace, have to have patience, because no two ESAs are exactly alike, right? Utah could not have taken the playbook from Indiana and said, oh, okay, we'll just copy what Indiana did, right? Someone has done this before, because no two policies are the same. No two parent communities are the same. They're not going to spend in the same way. So it's really a new frontier every time you launch a program. And you brought up a good example, trampolines, every state has their thing, right? And some of my colleagues use this example, and I really, really like it. It's the baking soda example, just to kind of illustrate the point, right? Baking soda as a grocery item, never allowed. Baking soda as an ingredient to a science experiment to learn chemistry, allowed. And so it illustrates the complexities of the decisions that need to be made about these allowable expenses. And it brings into to the conversation the layer of context of use of the item, right? You say that physical education is a core academic area, but then a trampoline can't be purchased for physical activity. So it's sometimes contradictory and very difficult to navigate. And so something that's incredibly important and critical to the success of the program is having community partners that are invested in the success of this program, sort of coming together to make these determinations about these allowable expenses. What that does not only for the program, but for the families that are just really trying to use these dollars to meet the needs of their children, it avoids the frustration that they feel when expenses are said that they're allowable, and then they're not allowable, and then they're allowable, but you need to, justify how and when and where you're using. We shouldn't have to do that for families. We want to be removing these barriers, not adding them.
Justin, coming to you next, because of your work helping families use ESA funds. What Jackie is describing sounds like just a lot of ambiguity. Like you can get to some degree of clarity based on statute and interpreting statute, and then there's always going to be these edge cases or these questions. How does that affect the families that outschool.org supports as they use ESAs? How do you see that ambiguity sort of influencing the decisions they make about whether and how they spend their funds?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, Jackie mentioned frustration. And I think for a lot of the families that we work with, there's also fear, right? And then that actually tends to be one of the largest friction points in terms of getting families to make use of the funds, even after they've gone through the process of applying and getting the funds. And what we see is that is often a reason, like the major impediment to the first purchase, particularly if it's a homeschooling family or a family not just making the choice to enroll in a traditional private school. And that is a really crippling fear for a lot of families, particularly who have never had to be engaged in this type of iterative back and forth policy conversation, particularly, behind an email or behind a chatbot. And it's really demoralizing, particularly for a lot of families for whom English isn't their first language, and they just don't have the tools or the fluency to navigate these. And given that it's a public policy where a lot of the way that these rules are presented are in the framework of accountability, it's, well, what happens if I make a mistake, right? Mm-hmm. Not only am I trying to not make a mistake on what I choose for my child being the right thing, but then I have to kind of have this added layer of, well, am I actually doing something wrong, illegal? And then what is the recourse for that? Am I not going to be reimbursed, or am I going to get charged? And I don't have the money to be charged back for that. And it's not their fault because, to your point, Julie, it's ambiguous, and it's, and that to some degree is okay, because I think one thing we have to zoom out and kind of name is that these policies are very new, right? There's not the same foundational history that we have in HSAs or FSAs where there are, millions of these transactions that have taken place. These are relatively new, and to the point, there are a lot of edge cases. And I think one of the things that we often find ourselves doing in being a navigator for families and being that kind of first point of contact is we're often taking these edge cases to the state where they're like, wow, we never even thought of that. And then it does require a conversation between us as the navigator, the wallet provider, the state, and maybe the state has to go back and look at statute and come back, where it takes a few days to make a decision. And so, of course, that's frustrating for families, and of course, it creates fear. But I think, sometimes there's a preponderance of this idea of accountability, right? Families have to be accountable, and it's on the family to make sure, but that's not the case right now, right? Where we know that the actual evidence of fraud is incredibly low. And part of that is because the technology providers have done a very good job at creating an ecosystem and creating a structure that is focused on accountability. And that is by design. And I think when we think about what are the programs and policies designed for right now, a lot of it is that prevention of fraud, and a lot of it is accountability. And if you look at any of the kind of RFPs that govern really how these policies are implemented, what you'll see is the primary considerations being put forth by the state are accountability and the minimization of fraud. Those are important things. But what you won't see to the same degree are metrics and accountability for providers around family usability and family experience. And I think that is a really important note, just to see kind of, to the point that was raised earlier of like, what are we doing this for, right? I think we have to begin to make sure that we're answering that question also in a way that moves beyond just accountability, because I think if we focus too much on that, we're going to end up creating an experience for families that is not the frictionless, not the empowering experience that a lot of us, I think that this can really help to embody.
Liz, with your policy wonk hat on,
I'm going to take a nerdier analytical zoom out a little bit. So I have two thoughts on this, really. Okay, so the first is I don't want to create. Oh, let me step back. Where do I even want to start, folks? Okay, first of all, I think it's important to say that I believe that if we're using public dollars, that we want to have public interest in how we use public dollars, and that's important. What I don't want is to have separate standards for how we expect those dollars to be used for one kind of education than we do for another kind of education. So one of the reasons I've been a little resistant also to some of the ideas around sort of intense oversight and accountability is because I don't think that they hold when we think about how we hold public schools accountable for the use of funds, which is to say, now public schools will say, well, we have to follow all these rules and RFPs and there are guidelines, and that is totally true. And it is unarguably true that public schools spend money on a lot of stuff that people would say, oh, you're buying trampolines for your pre-K program, right? And so what I want is a system where we think big picture about what we're trying to build, and then we have oversight and accountability for public dollars within that framework. But I think the other piece is, to me, is I always go to the counterfactual of like, well, like, I don't know, what happens if we don't do this? Like, this is a big experiment, right? I'm not here as a true believer. I'm here as someone who is curious and believes that there are new and better ways to do education that we should explore. Is this going to be the thing that works for all kids and changes everything? I don't know. But if we're going to do it, we got to actually do it. And part of that experimentation means we have to be uncomfortable with some ambiguity and the fact that some of this isn't going to go the way that we want. And trying to be overly restrictive on how we use these funds in this very early stage of innovation is going to artificially constrain what these programs might become. And so I would encourage us to be open to the idea of experimentation with certain guardrails, which I think are mostly in place. If you look at Arizona data, I mean, 85% at least of those funds are very clearly being used for tuition, tutors, and other direct instructional costs. That data is all public. So, are there marginal things that you could fight about? Maybe. There's marginal things everywhere we could fight about. We're not super smart about how we use public dollars all the time. I don't know if this is shocking news. But anyway, I'll just say, I think just intellectually, I want to have one standard that we expect everyone in education, and I think that needs, therefore, to be a broad standard. And I want us to be comfortable with some marginal waste, perhaps, in the name of trying to do something better.
Jackie, Justin, Liz says, let's run the experiment. What do you all say? How would you respond, or what perspectives would you add or differ on?
Go for it, Justin, or you came off mute first. Firstly, I agree, Liz. Absolutely agree with what you said. I think we're all doing the best with what we have as we move through this. And I think that for the majority of folks that are implementing these programs, we're doing it for the right reasons. We're doing it because we truly care about students first, right? And so when we talk about accountability and equity, I want to make sure we're talking about outcomes for students and not necessarily institutions, right? Because I think that I truly believe that the parents are best poised to make those decisions. And when we're analyzing and evaluating these programs, looking all different ways and all shapes and sizes, what it needs to come down to is, are students making progress in their fields, in their choices? Are they thriving? Are they prepared for whatever pathway they're going to pursue when they graduate high school and they are no longer eligible to utilize these scholarships for the educational environments they've chosen? And there's no one entity that can make that decision, right? I think it comes down to, my whole career I've been a data-driven lady, but sometimes it is not about quantifiable or qualitative metrics. It's a combination of both. We have to sort of expand outside of the way that we've typically measured those things. And as the educational landscape changes, so do the metrics.
Yeah. And I think, like, to the point of experimentation, I mean, education, anyone who's a parent or has been a teacher knows that education is one continuous experiment, right? You are always trying to find the thing that gives your kid the spark and then figure out how long it gives your kid the spark. And it's okay if it wasn't a fire, right? That little spark led to something else. And that is not quantifiable, right? Like, as much as we would love to be able to measure that, that is really hard. And for the most part, parents and families know when that is happening. Teachers know when they see a spark in a kid in a class and can go down a rabbit hole, right? And that requires experimentation. And I think one of the beautiful things about these policies, and the reasons that I got into this work and then outschool.org got into this work, was because it begins to allow, through a policy mechanism and through a public funding mechanism, that kind of experimentation for families who never had that ability, right? So for families who were really just given the ability to, like, not even experiment with their public school because they would have to change zip codes, to actually have the ability and opportunity to see a spark in a kid and then go down that path and say, okay, what type of education is best for that? And so to that degree, what we are funding and what these policies are supporting is experimentation. And I think, to Liz's and Jackie's point, is how do you create a policy mechanism and vehicle that is able to support that while also simultaneously enduring the political pushback that is, I think, a lot of the reason that legislators and the policies are very focused on accountability is because they're working to avoid the headlines, right? And they are working to avoid the use cases of fraud that do pop up, right? And that we've seen, the people buying 90, calculators and then reselling them for crazy prices. Like, it's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it's, if you design for the edge case, you're going to get a policy that exists at the edge case, not one that actually has the ability to fully catalyze experimentation, like it seems most of us believe on this webinar that it can provide for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
I think we're about to run. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah.
I'm feeling that if you design at the edge case line, Justin, that is an awesome line. I love that. I want to say that I think there's another area which we're artificially constraining based on policy, and that's on the supply side. And that's a whole other conversation, probably for another webinar. But some of the policies in place around what it takes to launch a new school, the buildings that you can use because of the way we structured e-building codes, which if you didn't think building codes were cool, do I have a whole other conversation for you? I worry about the policy ramifications and consequences of the supply side constraint, and I think it's an important part of the overall implementation conversation also.
Yeah, absolutely,
Liz. You were reading my mind, and love your thought about part 2 webinar. Love that. But I feel like what I don't want to see us do in this movement is create a new box. I would rather see us at a very high level respond to the organic expansion of this educational landscape with policies that make sense for where families are going to educate their children, right? It needs to be that sort of response model instead of us just trying to lift a new box and fit other people in it. One other quick point, Justin, you were mentioning about teachers, and certainly that resonates with me, but I think it's an important point to note that these policies, these programs are never going to substitute for the relationship between a parent and their child's educator, ever. And sometimes there are either rules or policies that sort of feel that the implementer, right, the state agency or the program manager is that middleman. How are you going to vet this provider and make sure that they're giving good quality services? Not my role. I have many, many, many other roles. That's not one of them. That I am never going to be the substitute for that parent trying those different things, right? Doing that experimentation, talking with their child's educator, whether it's a private school, a micro school, or reevaluating a hybrid model that they've done. That is their decision to make, and they're going to know their child best in that respect.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're running lots of small not so small, varying sizes of experiments at the state level, and we're about to run a big experiment at the federal level with the federal tax credit program included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, one of those. And the Treasury Department is going to be writing regulations around that. I would love to hear from each of you sort of the types of decisions that you see Treasury weighing and any advice you have. If you could write the regulations that would encourage the good use of these tax credit scholarships, what advice would you have for the regulators at Treasury? Liz, why don't we start with you, and then we'll invite Justin and Jackie in as well.
Great. I'm really excited about the opportunity here, but I think that in line with what we've been saying, I think that the best approach from Treasury, I think of what a lot of us are kind of hoping for is the lightest touch possible to kind of keep the regulations around these SGOs in line with how we think about similar kinds of organizations. So some guidelines around financial solvency and clear reporting. I also think that there's definitely a push, and I think it's probably the right push for if a governor opts in, they need to opt in for any SGO, which will allow from different kinds of organizations to raise money, right? So basically individuals can donate $1,700. That would be a full tax credit for $1,700. And you could donate it to, let's say Julie starts a ESA starts an SGO to pay tuition for whoever she wants, all the kids from her town. And Justin wants to start an SGO in the same state to pay for only low-income kids to go to, private schools. Fine. But let's say that Jackie wants to start an SGO to pay for after-school tutoring for kids who are performing below grade level. All of those could be eligible under this program. And I think that is really the opportunity here, is to think very broadly, and not just because when I'm not talking about this, I talk about tutoring like all the time. But I think that there's real opportunities to think about, as Jackie and Justin have both said, sort of what is the families are really looking for within their kids' education. And then these SGOs could be built out to help deliver that in different ways. And then we get to direct our own private money and get a tax credit.
Jackie, you're at an SGO. How do you think about the federal tax credit scholarship and the design of the policy as it comes to fruition at Treasury?
Yeah, so we're uniquely positioned as an SGO that already operates across 13 states. So we're thinking of it certainly at a multi-state level. We're working with different coalitions that are recommending some rules to the Treasury, working very closely with the Treasury. And so we're thinking operationally, we're thinking about compliance, because we know intimately how SGOs already operate. And so we're eager and encouraged, because the Treasury has been very open to our feedback, so as not to create overburdensome regulations and rules around SGOs that are already in operation. So, things like what it means to be located in a state, the administrative expense. So we're offering our guidance and our perspective, not only to these coalitions, but to other SGOs, because, as I mentioned, we're already multi-state. A lot of SGOs are very state specific, and they're thinking about scaling. And they're thinking about, do I have to change my mission? Do I have to change my scope? Do I have to support more students? There's so many questions swirling around, and we're trying to come alongside of those SGOs and provide them guidance as one of the larger SGOs in the country. But there are a lot of questions that we have about the way that the law is written, and it will be really helpful to see what rules are codified so that we can support, hopefully, students in, if not all 50 states, most of them, and focusing on constituents in each of those states to truly understand what that opt-in means. It's never a good message to say we can fundraise anywhere, but unfortunately we wouldn't be able to scholarship students in this state if the governor doesn't opt in. Nobody wants that.
Justin, if you had a direct line of communication into the ear of those writing the regulations at Treasury, what would your advice be? And especially anything you think that they might do to ensure access for families furthest from opportunity.
Yeah, I think, similar to Liz, I talk about tutoring and enrichment a lot. And I think we got our kind of start in this work by supporting Virginia's Learning Acceleration Grant, which was a tutoring program that gave $3,000 in tutoring funds to low-income families. And I think, and for me, is one of the gold standards in what this type of policy could really look like and what it could unleash in terms of accessibility across the country. And I think is a really compelling example for blue state governors and purple state governors of this does not have to feed into the narrative around it just being for private schools. And I think, to your prompt, Julie, I think folks writing this at Treasury should be very cognizant of that. And I think, and to the point that we've been coming back to in this webinar, it's hold the vision of the policy or what it could be firm and design around that. And I think if we're really trying to allow for families of all incomes across the country to get access to educational resources outside of just traditional school, private school aside, all of the other, allowable expenses that are really what drive a kid's education, how do we write rules that are accommodating for that, not just for the families, but also to ensure that there is the appropriate supply of SGOs that can then facilitate those types of transactions, which aren't just private school transactions and are more complicated to administer and to provide oversight for. Yeah. And then how do you provide the communication to the suppliers about what that means for them, right? And how they can come in and kind of be part of that initiative and help get access to more folks in their community. And I think there's this piece around infrastructure, right? I think, and this comes to the administrative, fee that Jackie spoke about. I do think one of the concerns that I have when looking at the legislation, it's, if there are only 10%, for a large SGO is perhaps a lot. For a small SGO, it's not. And so it really reduces your ability to provide infrastructure level support for families such as navigation, right? And so I think this is a new policy that is going to require both like taxpayers who are donating their credit to understand what this and is also going to be a big learning curve for families to understand, how do I operate and how do I function within this? And so I think designing around the family experience as well, right? And what are the standards that we want to be true, and what are the services that we know families will need in order to make this policy successful, is something that we should be paying attention to in the rules making process, because as we've discussed, that will ultimately be what influences the design of this policy and what it looks like for families.
Just a quick reminder for the audience to put any questions you have into the chat window, and we'll try to get to a couple. But one of the questions I have heard the most related to the federal program is which states will opt in and what might influence which states opt in. And I think we've actually touched on a couple of those in this conversation already, but I want to pull them out. One is, Justin, you mentioned the Virginia tutoring program, which was supplemental to students who are still enrolled in public schools. So it was really designed as to be an addition to public schools rather than an alternative to a child's public school enrollment. And my understanding, at least, and you all should feel free to disagree if you do, that the federal program right now is sort of silent on whether students need to be disenrolled from the public school in order to participate in this program. So I think that that's like a really interesting thing to watch. And then the second thing that we've talked a little bit about is who's eligible to provide services through the federal program. And are public schools, charter schools, and district schools among the eligible providers? And if so, what is the opportunity to sort of design around the education we want for children, being a little bit more agnostic about the how that happens or who provides it. And my sense is that is also something that the regulations could address, or maybe stay silent on in the statute as well. So would love to get your thoughts on those two questions, both like is this a supplant or supplement to public education? What are the opportunities there? And then what are the opportunities in terms of who can be a provider? How do you see that intersecting with which states might decide to participate or not? And Liz, I saw you come off mute, so take it away.
I won the draw on coming off mute first. So a couple things in terms of who's going to participate. I mean, I think right now I think there's 2 states that have said they definitely won't participate. I think everyone else is up for grabs and waiting for some of this regulatory language. I should have mentioned earlier so there is this word tuition involved in the bill. And what we're really hoping is there's going to continue to be flexibility about what tuition means, because tuition can mean a lot of different things. It can just mean paying for services, can be a form of tuition. So I do think it's important, from at least where I sit, that we're hoping that any regulatory language will allow for flexibility on what tuition means, so that we can have the broadest interpretation. I think that will allow the most states to want to participate for sure. And then it's like what we were talking about with the latter part is around this idea of the marketplace, and that one of the opportunities here is to create an education marketplace where public schools play and private vendors play and mom and pop stuff plays, and this is a way to continue testing that out. So I would this is, I guess, my inner libertarian coming out. I would like everyone to participate in a world where there's some guidelines, but anyone who wants to provide a good service that fits in the guidelines can and should participate. And that's how we get the kind of robust choices within this program that we would hope for.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Agree with Liz. So one of the questions you asked, Julie, was what will influence the governor's decision to opt in. And I'm going to flip that a little bit and say what should influence the governor's decision to opt in is the fact that all their K-12 students in the state can take advantage of this opportunity, right? To Liz's point, I would love to see a community of all different types of educational settings coming to the table in this marketplace and opening up their services for students to educate if they're looking for an opportunity or if they're staying put exactly where they are, right? There's so much that's wonderful about the provisions of this act that are sort of contrary to the typical arguments we hear about the state level programs. And I think that we are not talking about those enough. And I think that they should be underscored, because if you're sort of in this and hearing about it and reading about it and talking about it, you begin to understand that there's a lot of misinformation swirling around that results from a lot of people's interpretations. And that's kind of where we are right now, right? Everybody's just interpreting what the law is, and until the rules come out, it will remain to be seen. But I think one of the most important things is that it's clear that Coverdell applies to any student who is attached to their enrollment in a public, religious, or private school. And so there will be rules that are promulgated around that. But I think the law is clear that in order to be eligible to participate in the scholarship, the law says you have to be enrolled in or eligible for enrollment in elementary or secondary education.
Jackie, you mentioned this a little bit, and I would love to actually go from a comment that we got from the audience, which I think relates both to ESA programs and to the federal program, which is this question of targeted versus universal eligibility. It's just such a big question in this space, for the politics of it, for the implementation of it. Would love to hear briefly from each of you sort of where you stand, or what perspectives or trade-offs you see, even if you don't have a strong opinion, between this question of targeted versus universal.
I'll start since I'm already off mute, and then I'll pass it along to my colleagues here. But so obviously the provisions of the federal tax credit do state that a student must come from a household 300% or below area median income, which is very different than what we tend to see in a lot of targeted ESA programs, which tend to use federal poverty guidelines or federal poverty line. So it is much more expansive. And so for some of us, that's a wonderful thing. For others who are in the education space speaking about this, they tend to have a different opinion about who that this could potentially support. I mean, ACE has been committed to prioritizing low-income students for 25 years and will continue to do so. We're not changing our mission for implementation of the federal tax credit. We want to make sure that the students that are most in need are awarded the scholarships first. And my opinion is that that's sort of how these programs should either be prioritized. So Utah's a great example, right? Universal eligibility with prioritization for low-income families, or what I've seen some states adopt is sort of a phase-in system, which allows low-income students to be first to the plate, and then they are the first ones grandfathered into the program as the program continues, even as it expands in eligibility. And I think that's a really good model, because it ensures that the students who are most disadvantaged or are looking for these opportunities have the ability to take advantage before others.
I have a similar perspective to Jackie, which is, I think that, thinking even outside of the kind of the federal initiatives, that these policies really have the most opportunity to kind of provide immediate remedy for families who have not been given education opportunity before, or do not have access to the type of schooling and education that is necessary for their child to thrive. I think that we should make sure that the dollars are supporting those families first, and that even as programs become universal, which I do support, that those families maintain priority, and that there are stringent parameters and goals around what enrollment for those populations look like. I think that it's very easy for once a program goes universal to lose sight of what is the breakdown of the families who are actually in the program, right? And get kind of, okay, we've hit enrollment numbers and the program is growing, we're at 10% of the total population and onwards. But who constitutes that 10%? And are we really being intentional that this policy is not just increasing education divides that already existed, but now with like more taxpayer dollars behind it. I think there are some folks who don't think that these programs should go universal, and that's a conversation I'm always willing to entertain. But public school is universal, right? And I think if we have a vision for this and have a new vision for public education, that it is permissive, that it is expansive, then they should be universal. But we should have very clear and stringent bright lines around ensuring that, like, poorer populations and populations who have been at the margins are really given priority and in the driver's seat of what these policies look like and are designed for.
I know
Liz, any quick thoughts before we close this out?
I just want to say, like, in the name of being, like, this is something I wrestle with this, because my inclination is to want to prioritize low income kids. But I'm also think a lot about the fact that I'm not sure that as long as residential assignment is the primary way that we decide where kids go to school, I'm not sure that quality public school is universal. And so I sit with this a lot. And my last thought on this is that poverty isn't binary, and we tend to talk about this as sort of low income families and not low income families. And in my experience of talking to families using ESAs, it's just there's a really wide spectrum, and money is tight in a lot of cases that isn't where you might think it is, and it's more complicated than we want it to be.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks. And I'll add in, I think that there's a thread here on the supply side for our follow-on webinar that we'll have to arrange. Thank you all for joining us today. I know we're a couple minutes over here. You can learn more about Bellwether's work at bellwether.org or sign up for our newsletter. And that will be linked into the chat box. And again, we have recorded the session, and so we will be posting it and distributing it. So stay tuned for that if there's anything that you would like to revisit. And thank you to our panelists, Liz, Justin, Jackie. Really appreciate your thoughts today and for your willingness to engage in this really great conversation. Appreciate you all.